Okay, it is time to finally put the UVs away and begin making our scene look good. So, we're going to start with cameras and lights, as you probably gathered from the title of this video. The first thing I want to do, the very first thing, is I'm going to go to my UV test grid shader, go to my shading viewport, and I'm just going to disconnect the test grid. I'm still going to leave it there, but I'm going to disconnect that. So now everything is white, and it's a little bit less distracting. I might even make that um, material, if we go to the surface here, let's bring that and make it kind of a medium gray. Give us a neutral palette for when we start adding lights. Okay, cameras and lights. I've got a collection called Cameras and Lights. There's currently one camera in there because this is where I'm rendering all of my YouTube thumbnails. But if you deleted the default camera or whatever, add a camera. We're going to add probably 2, maybe 3 to start. And these are just to get a general idea of where you might want your final renders. You're not locked into these by any means. We're going to have a wide shot, and then we're going to use that as our predominant test for if lighting and everything is looking good. And then we'll have a handful of close-ups. We will certainly have a close-up of some sort on the vending machine, and then another one potentially up here. We'll kind of see how things start to shake out once we start adding lights and materials and textures. So I'm going to select this camera, and it is my active camera, so I'm going to hit 0 on the number pad. I'll zoom out here so you can see, here's the camera. And what I want to do is, there's a couple ways you can do this. You can either kind of position your viewport where you think you want that wide shot to be, and then you can go View, Align Active Camera to View. And you can see the shortcut is Control-Alt number pad 0. So I do that, the camera is going to snap to that view. Now this camera currently has depth of field on, so I'm going to turn that off for now. It's really just getting in the way more than it's helping. I'll also turn off the limits because I don't need that big crosshair here. So now we have this roughly where we want it. To fine tune it, what I like to do, you can just hit like G and X and slide it around and things like that. But if we hit N and go to our View tab, we can lock the camera to the view. And then while I'm here, I'll turn on screencast keys. But we can lock the camera to the view. So now, if I just middle click and drag, it orbits the viewport and the camera around. You can shift middle click to pan and control middle click to zoom. So by doing this, and I'm also going to go to solid view for now, we can begin to position our camera where we think would be an interesting position. Now I want it to be somewhere where I'm going to see most of the scene, because again, this is going to be the wide shot. So I think we'll start with maybe something like this, and I'll zoom in a little bit. Okay, we can also get our camera options, and we can adjust the focal length. We don't have to be tied to the default 50 millimeters, or in this case, I'm at 35 millimeters. I probably wouldn't go too much wider than 20, because you're going to start getting some fisheye effects. So if I hit G and double tap Z, it's going to, whoops, make sure I have the camera selected. If I hit G to move the camera, and then double tap Z, it's going to move it in along the axis that the camera is pointing. So if we go wider than 20, like 14, you're going to get some really weird fisheye stuff. But, you know, if you want a more wide angle, 24 is a pretty classic wide angle focal length. You maybe do something like that. And kind of fine tune the camera like that. Okay. And then I'm also going to rename this camera. We'll call it Cam01 Wide. And then I will hit N, unlock the camera to view. And then if you want to make sure this camera stays where you want it, hit I and set location and rotation. That way, if you accidentally forget that you had lock camera to view on, or you move the camera, so let's say, you know, I'm moving stuff around and accidentally move the camera over here. Oh crap, how do I get back to where that camera was? You just have to change frames. So if we just drag the timeline around and go back to frame 1, you see that the camera's back where it was, and we're back in our established view. That's the first camera. Let's add 2 more real quick. So I'm just going to hit Shift A, add camera. Right away, I'm going to rename it, so I'm going to hit F2 to rename. This will be camera 02. And we'll call this VM for vending machine. I now want to make this the active camera, so I can go to View, Cameras, View, Cameras, Set Active Object as Camera, or Control number pad 0, which is one that I use frequently. And then from here, we can just jump right into Lock Camera to View. And we can start moving it around. And we can see our focal length is 50 millimeters. We can leave it at that for now. Gotta figure out what's going to be an interesting view. So maybe we can go something like this. It's kind of an interesting and unique thing, especially if let's turn on our depth of field, and we can set our focus object. Yeah, I think that should work. We'll set the focus object to the screen mesh. And then as we bring our f-stop down, you can see now the foreground is slightly out of focus. Go to Material Preview and you'll get a little bit potentially better. We can even go to Rendered View to see this depth of field even more clearly. So in this case, an f-stop of 1 seems to work pretty well. I don't want to go too far with it. But the nice thing about this is it really focuses our eye on the vending machine, which is very much the point of this particular shot. Oops, and I moved the mouse accidentally. Let's reframe that. Yeah, I think we can. I'm just looking at the side, but as I was saying, we're not locking this into the final view, so it doesn't have to be perfect at this point. So once I have it roughly where I want it, again, I'll hit I, set keyframe for location and rotation. We can also go back to our solid viewport. And I'm going to hit N and turn off lock camera to view. Now let's do one more. So we'll just add one more camera. Again, hit F2. So be cam 03. And then we'll call this one electrical. Because I want more or less this camera. First, I'm going to hit Control 0 to make that the active camera. Control number pad 0 to make that the active camera. And then I'm going to position my viewport kind of over here somewhere. And then I will hit Control Alt number pad 0. And that's going to align the camera to my view. Again, those are in the view, camera and view, align view options. Okay, so now that I have that, we'll turn on our lock camera to view again and fine tune our camera. For this one, I think I'm going to go with a little bit wider than the default 50 millimeters. Let's try 35. Kind of zoom it in a little bit. I don't want to see behind the wall. I don't mind seeing the top, but I don't want to see behind it. So this will be a good view. It'll show kind of our electrical panels, and there'll be some glowing stuff here. It'll show this big sign nice and clear. Maybe we could go down, tilt up a little bit. Nah, kind of like the higher angle. Okay, so we'll start with that for now. I'll hit I and set our keyframes. Hit N and turn off lock camera to view. And that'll be good for now. I'm not going to worry about depth of field on that one or this one for now. Once we have the cameras kind of in the final place, then we'll deal with that. I'm also not planning on, at least as far as this project is concerned, I'm not worried about doing any animated cameras. I'm just thinking about still frames. Although I may, if time permits, do 1 or 2 animated renders, just because I think it'll look cool if I can add some motion in there. So last thing, just for organization's sake, I'm going to select all of the cameras and just make sure, hit M. Oh, get out of local view. I didn't realize I was in local view. Select all the cameras, and we will just move those into the correct collection, camera and lights. So the cameras are set up. I'm going to select my wide angle again and hit Control number pad 0 to make that the active view again, so that now anytime I'm moving around and I want to go back to my camera view and I hit 0, that's the camera that it goes to. No, we can see kind of off the side here, which I don't love. So let's take a moment and fix that, because that will bother me a lot. So we just need to move the camera over just far enough. Something like that. And then we can kind of rotate it around. Something like that. I think that's better. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to hit I and set new location rotation keyframes there. All right, I think that's everything with the camera that we want to do. Now we can start doing some lighting. And I want to do lighting, at least establish some base lighting first before we do any materials, just so I can jump into rendered view and get an idea of what things are going to look like in the given environment. Um, you can kind of do them in either order. It doesn't really matter. What I'll actually end up doing when I'm working through this is kind of going back and forth um, a little bit and jumping, especially with anything that uses an emission shader. It's going to be a lot of back and forth there. Let me also make sure I turn on my cable brackets. And good. I will also disable viewport visibility for my other two cameras, just so they're not floating around in the background. And I think we're ready to start adding some lights. So I want to set up my viewport. Actually, we're just going to go to the shading viewport. And we're going to start by talking about the world scene. So right now I do have a world texture applied, and if I turn on, it does have camera visibility. Oh, it's because I have transparency. If I turn that off, okay, you can see that there is a world texture applied, which is apparently somebody's like backyard or something. I don't know. It gives interesting light, but I don't want to use this for the final render. I want to use a little bit of volumetric world shader. So it's going to give like a nice fog effect, and I can show you a preview of what I'm going for. Now this is subject to change. Okay, so this is without any world volumetrics. And then there it is. There's with world volumetrics. You get this kind of hazy glow. You can start to see some of the hazy like directionality from the lights, and a little bit of the sourciness there. So that's kind of where I want to go, and I really love that. But you can't use a volumetric shader with a global HDRI image, because the HDRI image is calculated from infinitely far away, and the haze of the world, when you're dealing with infinite distances, basically fully occludes that image. So there are ways around it. You can actually map that HDRI image to custom geometry. You can add a cube or a sphere and map it to that. But I don't want to go through any of that trouble. I really like how this looks. I don't think I really need to see any more. So I'm just going to leave it like that. Obviously, you're free to do what you want. Live your life. So back in Blender, we've got this HDRI. Now, HDRIs are still useful for kind of previewing what your scene is going to look like. So if we're here in Material Preview, there are a couple of setup things that I want to do. First, I'm going to turn off my widgets because I don't need those. And then I'm also going to turn off HDRI Preview, which is going to get rid of those spheres in the bottom. And then I'll go over here to our viewport shading options, and I'm going to turn down the world opacity. Okay, now I'm also going to change my HDRI. I've got a couple of custom ones loaded in here, but there's also plenty of kind of built-in ones. So we can go for something super neutral like this. Now it's tough to see when you don't have color, but you see it's just flat, neutral, white light. But I also have this one loaded in here, and this is an HDRI that I found. I did a Creative Commons search for it, and I do have the link here. But you basically just search for, anywhere on the internet you can search for HDRI. But I did a Creative Commons search, and actually, let me just pull this one tab over. I just did this one Hdri search and came up with this. It's free to use as long as you attribute it, so this is who it is by. They took the image. Yeah, so I loaded that into Blender. Remember, you can just go to this little gear icon and load in your custom HDRIs. Okay. So that's one thing that we can keep handy. For now, I will keep it on a more neutral one. We can even use something like this where it's got a nice directional sun. And then same thing for the rendered view. Right now, I am not using the scene world, just because if I use the scene world, well, you'll see what the scene world is, but I'm going to set that scene world. I'm going to clear out the HDRI and set the, actually go to my world shader here. And I'm just going to delete the environmental texture node and set the world color to black. So now there's no light in the scene whatsoever, and there's also no lights, so we're not going to see anything. So right now in rendered view, I will disable scene world so I can at least see something. Then when we start adding lights, we can change that around. And I kind of jump back and forth depending on what I'm looking for. Let's go to the shaded preview here, and let's begin adding some lights. Now, what I'd like to start with is just practical lights. And by practical, it's a film term, but it means a practical light is a light that you see on camera, basically. So these are the lights that are going to be motivated by what's in your scene, by the geometry that's in your scene. And one of the big ones are these pylons. We rotate around this side, you can see that I have this little cutout, and I do intend for that to be a light. So I think for now, I will eventually make this little square emissive. But to start, what I want to do is just add a light. Okay, so I'm gonna do both because there's something that I want to explain with that. So I'm going to bring up my shader options here. And as I said, I want this face to emit light, so that's going to be an emission shader. But I don't want the rest of it. Actually, these pylons are going to be three separate materials. It's going to be the main body of the pylon, and then there's going to be this little frame is going to be metallic, and then I'm going to have the emissive. So in my material options here, I'm going to first hit the X to get rid of the UV test grid, and I'll click New, and I will call this pylon body. And I'll add one more texture, and we'll call this one pylon metal. And then the last one, we will call this pylon emit. And then just so I can differentiate them, I'm going to take the pylon metal. You can expand the preview if it helps to see what's going on. I'm just going to make it a little bit darker, and I'm going to bring the metallic all the way up. This is temporary. Eventually, we'll add some textures, but just for the preview, it helps. And the pylon body, I'll make it a little bit darker, but not as much. And maybe a smidge on the tan side, but still keeping it pretty neutral. And for the emit, where it says principled BSDF, I'm going to click on that. I'm going to change it to an emission shader. And we'll leave it there for now. We'll get to the rest of that here in a second, but we need to assign these materials to our mesh. So by default, whatever's in the first slot is going to be assigned to the entire mesh. So what we really need to do is only figure out what's going to get the metal and what's going to get the emission shaders. So I'm going to hover over, we're going to select a face, hover over it and hit L. It's going to select linked. Now I have delimit seam set, so it'll select those UV islands, which because we put seams where there's going to be a differentiation in shaders, then it works out perfectly. I'm also going to double check screencast keys. There it goes, so you can see that. Okay, so we have that. I'm also going to hover over here and hit L, select all of that. I'm going to click on my pylon metal material and click Assign. We tab back into object mode. Now you can see that that has been assigned. Okay. And now we just have to assign the emit, and that's going to be this face right here. And I want it to actually be all of these back faces, so I'm going to hit Control plus. It's going to grow my selection, and then I can choose my emission shader and click Assign there. Okay, so I have that. Now, I'm going to select that center face again, hit Shift S to snap my cursor to it. Whoa. Shift S, cursor to selected, not selection to cursor. Go back into object mode, Shift A, and add in a point light. All right, so here's my point light. And I'm going to set the power to 0 because I want to illustrate something first. Okay, so I've got my pylon, I've got my emission set up. So let's go into a rendered view, and we'll change this back to scene world. And right now, you can't really see anything. There's no indication that there's light coming out of it. If we spin around, we can see that there is light coming from the face. It is working, but it's not powerful enough to light the scene. So what we can do, if we go to our shader editor and change it back to object, and make sure that we have the emit material selected. Okay, we can adjust this emission. We can set this up to 10. You start to see some stuff, but you're also going to see some fireflies, because this is a noisy way to add light to your scene. If we want it to really be strong enough to, for instance, read on the wall, which kind of does, but not really, we're going to have to go up a lot, and now we're really getting some fireflies going on in there. So we go to 100, and that's a lot. So sometimes it is better to add a light, add an actual light object to sort of what's called carrying the light. That's something that's done in film all the time, where if you have like a desk lamp, it might look good to your eye, but the camera might not think, it might not be bright enough for the camera. So what you end up doing is adding an additional light off camera that is adding more light from the same angle and color of the light that's on camera, and that carries the light, adds more light to the scene. We're doing a similar thing here. So I'm going to set my emission strength down to like 10. I might even go lower. But now I'm going to select the actual light that I have. And first I'm going to bring that radius down so it fits inside this area, so something like that. And let's also, I'm going to hit G and Y, just move it forward a little bit so it's not intersecting with the mesh. That'll work. Okay. So now let's go back to our rendered view. And remember, the power is still at 0. And you can see some of the fireflies we're getting from that emission. Now let's bring this power up. Now we're at 10, seeing the back wall pretty well. Let's actually compare. Let's take this emission. So here's the emission at 10, and we find that light that I just added. Okay, point light. We should also name these lights. So let me hit F2, and we will go pylon 0.01. Okay. Then I'm also going to hit M and move it to my camera and lights. And let's make sure that collapse that collection. We can collapse that collection. I'm going to select or click on the little box icon in camera and lights. That's going to make it the active collection. So anytime I add a new object, it will automatically be added to this collection. Okay, so once I have that there, which went too far, I want to first let's turn back on our viewport display or render display on our selectability. Then I'm going to disable the pylon for a moment, and we can kind of compare these things. So go back to our rendered view, and here is our mission surface at a strength of 10, and we got some fireflies and then barely seeing anything else. Okay, so let me take a quick screenshot of that. Okay, and now I'm going to set my strength of that emit to 0 and turn on my point light, and now that's at a strength of, if I select the light, that's at a strength of 10 right there. It's going to take a second to render, and we're still getting some fireflies. That's the nature of a scene like this, especially when it's so stark. And then we will, actually I don't need to take a screenshot, I can just compare. So here's, it's pretty obvious in this case. Here's with just the emission, here's with the light. And then on this side you can kind of see it, but because our emission is set to 0, we need to bring that emission. We'll just set the emission to 1. So now it looks like it's emitting light. Although it looks like we probably need to bring that up a little bit. Let's try 5. Yeah. If it was too dim, like if this is at 1, the surface doesn't look like it's bright enough to be emitting the light that's casting on the scene. So if we bring this up a little bit and it starts to blow out, yeah, I think we will stick at 5. Now it looks like this is bright enough, and it looks like this is what's actually emitting the light on our scene. Okay, so there is our first pylon light. This doesn't have to do a lot. This isn't going to be the primary source of illumination in our scene, but it's going to add some texture, and it's an easy place to start to kind of figure out, we know we want these lights here, and let's start establishing those before we move on. Last thing I want to do with this light is I'm just going to adjust the color a little bit. I want to make this a little bit on the blue side. Something like that, maybe. Let me jump into my material preview. I'll turn on scene lights and scene world. Oh, I'm using, that's what was happening. I was adjusting the emission surface and not the actual light. Okay, so you can see the emission surface is that color blue, but the light itself isn't, and that's what I was doing wrong. So let me select the light, and we'll change the light's color. I'll go back to my rendered view because it's a little bit more accurate. And, all right, so let's find a nice blue tint. I don't want to go too far. I don't want to go like that. I just want to kind of subtly tint it. It might not look like much now, but when we put this in contrast with pure white lights and some amber lights, it's going to read a lot more. Okay, so we'll go with that. And then I want to make sure the emission is this same color, so I'm going to hover my mouse over this color, hit Control-C to copy it, select my pylon and my emission shader, hover over color and hit Control-V, and it's going to paste that color onto the emission shader. So now, this face, rotate around here, is going to be the same color as the light that's coming out of it. It looks a little bit brighter because we have a value greater than 1, but that's okay. It's doing the job that I want it to. So what we can do is do the same thing to the rest of these objects. So let me go to solid view. And what I'm going to do first is just duplicate this light. I'll select the light, Shift D, X, and I'm just going to get them close for now. Shift D, X, Shift D, X. Okay, now I can come back in here. I'll zoom in here. I'm going to select the face, Shift S, cursor to selected. Tab out to object mode, select the light, Shift S, selection to cursor. Okay. Do the same thing over here. Select the face, selection there, and then snap that over. And same thing over here. Select the face, cursor to selected, select that, selection to cursor. Okay. And then on the last thing is I'll select these 3 lights, and just like I did on the first light, I'll go into the side view here. I'm going to slide them forward, or slide them in the Y direction, so that they're not intersecting with a mesh. Okay, so now all those lights are in the same spot. And the last thing that we need to do, we go back to this preview, is we need to set the same materials for the pylons that we did on the first one. So again, that's going to be just hover over the faces, L and L, metal and assign, L, L, metal and assign, And same thing over here. Let's zoom in here so we can focus on it. L and L, metal, and assign. The last thing is we'll select those center faces that need to emit some light. Okay. I'm going to hit Control plus to grow those selections, and then we can assign our emission shader. Now we can go to our rendered view and see what we got. Okay, so we got some nice subtle light. Now as we start adding some more interesting materials and reflections and things to the scene, these will, we can come back to these and adjust them. We probably won't have to adjust the emission material, but the lights themselves, we will probably go back and adjust the intensity as necessary. I'm also going to rename these real quick. So we'll say 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So, more lights. The next kind of obvious practical thing is the vending machine. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to hide the glass on the vending machine. So let me expand that group, and I'm going to, let's see, that's going to be vending machine body, vending machine glass. I'm just going to disable it in the viewport. This way, if I hide and unhide things, it'll still stay hidden. And that's just because the glass material won't preview in material preview. Not very well anyway. So for now, we'll just hide it and we'll come back to that in probably the next video. But I just want to add a little light in here. Again, this is just going to be a placeholder, so I'm going to shift right click, put my 3D cursor kind of up in here. Something like there. Okay, then I'm going to hit Shift A, add in a light. I'm going to do, probably end up being an area light, so I'll do that. We'll hit F2 right away to name it, and we'll call it VM light, vending machine light. Just enough so that I know what it is. And then we can go in here. We're going to move it down a little bit. We're going to move it in the X direction a little bit. We can also adjust the size of it. And then I'm going to change it from square to rectangle. And bring that Y direction down some more. Okay, so that's that for now. Again, all these things are subject to change as we fine-tune the look. I want to start establishing that. And then the last thing I think I'm going to do, so I'm just going to give it a little bit of a kind of a gross greenish, maybe a little bit of yellow tint. Something like that. We can jump to our rendered view. And you can kind of see what that's doing. Yeah, I think that's working. We're getting a little bit of that kind of spilling out, and now we're starting to see some color contrast, which adds some nice visual interest there. Okay. So now, let's see, what do we want to do next? Let's do some environmental lighting. So when I say environmental lighting, what I mean is lights that, I mean, they're lighting the environment, but they're not necessarily practicals. They're not motivated by actual geometry in the scene, but they make sense in the environment. So I mean, the first thing is I'm going to just add a couple of streetlights. So I'm going to hit Shift C to center my 3D cursor. Shift A, add in a spotlight, and hit F2, and I'll rename this streetlight. Okay. Then we're going to move this up. I'm going to front view, so I have, it looks like about the right size there. And let's change the radius. Well, let me compare this to, I don't have my other scene open. going to compare it to what I did before. We can just eyeball it. Let's bring the size of the spot shape down a little bit. Let's also go and change our viewport shading. Disable scene or enable scene world, and we're going to bring that power up. Let's try 500. Okay, so now we can see our spotlight. So I want to first, I'm going to crank that blend all the way up. And then let's check, we can double check that size. Maybe we want to go a little bit wider. Something like that. I don't want to cover the whole street, and I want a couple. I want pools of light, I want some contrast, and I want some gradation here. So I think that probably works pretty well. Go back to our scene world here. And I'm going to increase that power to 1,000, just to make it a little bit more visible for now. And let's position that. So let's go G and X. I want it hitting the street, and then a little bit on the sidewalk. Maybe something like that. We'll increase the size and move it out in the Y direction. And I don't want it to overpower the sidewalk. There's going to be other light hitting that, but I don't mind it splashing a little bit, and it just makes sense that it would splash a little bit. Okay, now for color. I could just, grab another color and that'd be perfectly fine, but I want to show you a different way that you can do color. If you're familiar with photography or filmmaking, or just generally the concept of white balance, you can set a specific color temperature to a light in Blender. It just takes a couple extra steps. So what you want to do is you want to select your light, and then in your light properties, select use nodes, and then you get nodes that you would for any material or shader. We've got our emission node, and we want to add a, I believe it's in converter and black body. So black body is where you set your color temperature. So we connect that up, and let me jump to rendered view here. So color temperature is to calculate color temperature, you use a black body object, which I think is where this gets its name. But it's basically the temperature, it's the color that something glows at a specific temperature. So, for instance, your traditional incandescent tungsten filament light bulb, that has a color temperature, generally speaking, of right around 3,200 degrees Kelvin. Okay, and this is the color that you get. You get that nice warm amber. It's a fantastic color. It looks great on skin tones. The sun, on the other hand, if we were talking about direct sunlight, high noon, right around 5,600 degrees Kelvin. It's much closer to what we would consider a pure white light. If we're talking about a cloudier day, then we're more around 6,000. And you see it gets a little bit bluer. And then as the clouds increase, or we're a little bit more on the blue side, it's a really blue sky day, you might get somewhere around like 8,000. You get really blue. Then you got lights in the middle. Some lights are like 4,200. Some even have a green tint to it. So what you could do, potentially, if you wanted to increase that green tint, is we could add a mix RGB node in here and kind of go with a greenish yellow. And we'll set this color temperature to like 5,600 maybe. Or no, we'll go like 4,800. Okay, and then as you increase and decrease this factor, you start to get some of that green tint. This might look better if we go up to 5,600. Okay, which would be more of like a fluorescent sort of thing going on. Depending. But we don't really need that mix node. I just wanted to set this to, let's actually go 2,800. Go nice and warm on that, again, for some more color contrast. And then I don't want this light to be this powerful and this strong. I want this to be more of a subtle thing. So I'm going to bring that power way down. So let's try 400. That's probably pretty good. Might go 300. And again, we can come back to this later and adjust it. Let me increase the size of my spotlight to like 60 degrees. And I'm going to G and Y and move it out a little bit. And let's bring the spies back down to like 50. Yeah, we'll do something like that. 250 on the power. Subject to change, of course, as everything is. We're not doing any committing here today. All right, so once I have one, then I just have to hit Shift-D, duplicate, hit X to lock it to the X-axis, and add our second one. We can turn on scene world so we can see our lights a little bit better here. And I want to have a gap in the pool of lights. Again, I want to see some gradation there. It's GX. Maybe I'll do something like that. Then maybe I'll take this light and I'll move it over a little bit further. We're just kind of hitting a little bit of that truss. Okay, so let's look at our rendered view now. All right, starting to feel a little bit more like an environment. There's two more big environmental lights that I want to add. The first, as I was looking at this, and we can look at through our camera view here, I wanted to just add something to bring up this truss a little bit. And so what I figured is, this is a city street. There'd probably be a car of some sort. If it's Cyberpunk, maybe it's a hover car, but it's a car. So I'm going to shift right click over here to move my 3D cursor in that area. And we can go back to our material preview for now. And I'm going to hit Shift A, add in a point light. And I will call this one headlight. And I'll just do one headlight. Maybe it's a motorcycle or a hover bike. Something like that. Maybe a Kia is driving by, or Tetsuo. And I'll put it somewhere around here. It's actually going to be kind of off the road. But what it's going to do is it's going to reflect. And especially when we make this metallic, it's going to reflect that. It's actually, if we just temporarily select this collection, change our material to that pylon metal that we made earlier. Actually, no, we'll make a new material now. There's no reason not to. So we'll call this metal truss. And all I'm going to do is increase the metallic quality of it and make it just a little bit darker. Okay, so now that we've done that, whoops, then I actually need to apply that to all the objects. So let me hit Control L and make links to materials. And now all of them have that metal truss. Not that, but all these have the metal truss material applied to them. Okay, so now we can start to see some of these highlights coming from our headlight here. Let's increase the power of this. Let's go to 100. That's probably too much, but we can check that in a rendered view. It's maybe a little too much. Let's go with 80 or even 60. Okay, go with that. Let's say that they are like those really obnoxious bright xenon headlights that I also have. So we'll go a little bit towards the blue. You know what? Let's do another black body. So I'm going to add in our converter black body. Connect that up. And set our color temperature. Ooh, that's kind of cool too. This looks like a fire or something. But we'll set that to, let's try 8,000. I don't know the color temperature of xenon headlights, so I can check that real quick. I'm sure it's pretty bright. Oh, actually, yes, they're not that bright, according to Google. Some do get pretty bright, and this is kind of the range that I'm going for. I guess it's ice blue, according to marketing. Yeah, a nice blue light. Kind of like, that might be still too much. Maybe go 40. With the metallic, it doesn't need a whole lot. But at the same time, when we give this a darker texture, we might need to bump it back up. Okay, so I'm good with that. The next thing, as I'm looking through this, is we did all this work for the electrical panels. I want to make sure that we can see them. So let me add in a light for those. Let me go back to our scene world here. And this is where setting up an HDRI that's closer to your final scene kind of helps. You get a better sense of what's going on. Now, granted, this HDRI has a purple tint to it, but it's at least darker. We could choose one of the other darker ones too, to get a sense in the preview of what this will look like. We'll stick with that. All right, so I wanted some sort of a light up here just to give our electrical panels a little bit of illumination. And this is where I started getting a little bit less realistic with light, or at least less motivated. I'm going to add in an area light. And we can call this F2. Light electrical. Sure. As long as it's descriptive enough that you know what it is, your name can be anything that works for you. All right, so we've got this light. Again, I want this to be rectangular. And then in the Y direction, we can kind of shrink it down a little bit. The X direction, we're going to elongate it. And I'll move it in the X direction as well. Let's move it up. Well, actually, no. I want to keep it pretty close to that top, because I don't want this to be a very strong light. And I want to see that fall off. So one of the important things to know about light is that it follows the inverse square law of for fall off. So every time you double the distance away from the light, the intensity is a quarter as bright. Okay, so if the intensity right up against the light is 10, if you double the distance, or let's say you're a foot away from the light, and the intensity here you read at 10 foot candles, which is a unit of measurement for the intensity of light, is 10 foot candles. If you double that distance from 1 foot to 2 feet away, that intensity is going to go not in half. It's not going to go in half to 5. It's going to go all the way down to 2.5 foot candles. All right, it's going to be a quarter of the intensity when you double the distance. So what that means, practically speaking, is if we move this light way up here, then if the light all the way down here is 10, if we just go a little bit further down, it's still going to be pretty close to 10. It might be like 9.8, but it's still going to be in that general area. You'd have to go all the way down to the ground for that intensity to go, be cut into a quarter at 2.5. Right, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. I know it was something that took me a little bit of time to understand, but basically, the closer you are to the light, the quicker the fall off. All right, the quicker that light gets dimmer. And I want to see that fall off effect. So I want that light to be pretty close. All right, and then I also want the light to look interesting, so I'm going to make it red. I'm just going to go full-blown 100% red. Okay, so let's take a look at that. We'll go to our camera view, and I'm going to turn off our overlays. And then I'm also going to do something that I haven't shown you yet. And I'm going to just render a region. So as your scenes gets more complicated and you need to render certain things to see how they're working, it can really bog down the system if you have to render everything. So instead what we can do is just render a region of the screen. And to do that, we go to the view, and I gotta remember where this is. View regions and render region. So Control B, it's gonna bring up some crosshairs, and then you just have to select the area that you want to render, and then when we go to our rendered view, it's only going to render that area, and we can zoom in on it and see it a little bit better. Okay, and we can see how that red light is playing in our scene. Okay, so let's make a little adjustment to this light. Turn on our overlays again. Let me turn that off. Okay. I'm just going to move it forward a little bit, I think. I want it to just wash down the front of this a little bit more. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Okay, starting to establish our scene. And then There's one more kind of environmental light that I want to add that's not specifically called for in the geometry, and that's going to be in our electrical box right here. So I'm going to hit Shift S and snap the cursor to that. Cursor to selected. Zoom in a little bit. And then we'll Shift A, add in a point light. And we will call this electrical box glow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick it right in the center here. Let's go into wireframe so I can see what's going on. Going to go kind of right in the center of the box. And I'll move it back in the Y direction so it kind of fits in there. And then I want to bring down the radius here because it's too big. Something like that will work. And maybe we'll bring it a little bit lower. Okay. Look at our material preview. Now we got some light coming out of the box, which is cool. We also got these glowing vents. So go to our camera view. I want to clear the render region, which I believe is view regions. Clear render region is Control-Alt-B. Now I've got a Booleans add-on, the built-in Booleans add-on, which doesn't actually... Oh, it does. Okay. Before it wasn't working, but maybe because I don't have an object selected. It defaulted, but you can always just go up to the menu and choose Clear Render Region. And then I'll hit Control-B again, and I'm going to make this the render region now. Let's actually go all the way down, because I do want some of this light to hit towards the bottom. And now let's go into rendered view. And even bring this down and zoom in a little bit to see that a little bit clearer. All right. I also want this color to be, I'm going to do that same 100% red. I'm just going to set the hue to 1. And then we can increase the power to maybe like 30. All right, so now we're getting some of that glow. It's probably going to be too much to ask to get that all the way down to the ground. Like we could set it to 100. Well, I don't hate that. It's maybe a bit much. I'm going to go back to 30. Again, we can always adjust it later. Look at our material preview and kind of see we'll have some of that glowing stuff coming out from underneath. It'll just be a nice little accent that will work well. Control-Alt-B and clear the render region. But I think will work well for the overall scene and just gives a little bit of extra texture. Because this is a fully red light, even though it's pretty bright, it's not going to draw the eye as much as like this somewhat darker light here, because it's a whiter color. So this is reading to us as a brighter light, even though the intensity in here is only 10, and the intensity up here is 30, and the intensity over here is actually only 10. So our eye is still going to be drawn over here, and we're going to make these windows glow in the next video, and that's really going to be probably the primary source of illumination in our scene. So we'll see how that all plays out. But the last thing I want to do in this video, as far as lighting is concerned, is add some additional emission materials to our scene. And that's really going to start making this feel less like a normal city street and more like a cyberpunk street. So to do that, one, let's jump into material preview here. Okay. And when I think of cyberpunk things, I think of glowing, kind of just random glowing things. I mean, you can even look at this like in the current PC, custom PC market where everything has LEDs on it. Mice and keyboards and RAM and everything has LED. I'm just going to take that a little bit further here to the not so distant cyberpunk dystopian future. So let's figure out what we want to start with, and let's say we start with these cables. I'm going to show you a few different options. I haven't committed to one on my own, but I'll show you a few different options here. And we'll also go back to a regular or a more neutral HDRI for now. All Right, so if I want this cable to glow, first of all, I don't want the whole cable to glow in this instance, so I'm going to give it two materials. One that's going to be just a regular cable material, and then one that's going to be the actual emission. So I cleared out the UV test grid material. I'm going to add a new one. We will call this cable base. Okay, and again, this is in the first slots, so it's going to be first in the list. So that means it's going to, by default, give everything that material. Then I'm going to click the plus to add a new material slot. Click new material, and I will call this cable emit teal. Okay, that gives you a clue as to what this is going to be. Also, looking at this, it looks like our cable brackets didn't get the right material assigned to them. So I'm going to select those objects, hold down Shift, select the back wall, Control L, and make links to materials, just so they get the same materials, just so it's less distracting. Okay, so cable material base, for now, we'll bring down the preview. I'm just going to make it an almost black, maybe decrease the roughness a little bit. Oops. Decrease the roughness, maybe decrease the specular as well. Something like that. We'll come back to it and adjust it later, because I'm not really concerned about it. I just want that as a point of contrast for our cable emit teal. All right. So let's make our emission shader. So I'll keep that preview expanded for a moment. I'm going to change the shader type from principled BSDF to an emission. I'm going to set our color to teal. All right, we're going to work a lot with teals and yellows and magentas, all these secondary colors of light. Because again, that's a very 80s kind of retro future synth wavy vibe. Okay, so we've got our color there. Now we need to tell Blender where we want that emission. So let's see. We've got a few different options here, and I'll show you, since we have 4 cables, I'll show you 4 different options. The first would be, let's say we want just like one stripe running down the side. So I'm just going to Alt-click on this edge right here. It's going to select the whole edge loop. I'm going to select my cable emit teal and click Assign. And now we've got one stripe running down the whole thing. Okay, we can go to rendered view and see that that is in fact there. And if we come over to these brackets, you can see that that glowing is affecting our scene. But maybe not enough, so maybe we want to increase that strength to something like 3. Now we get a nice glow. I don't want to go too far. These aren't actually meant to light the scene. This is more just for effect. Right? It's going to give us this really nice ambient kind of glow, because that's what it is. It is glow. Okay, this doesn't need to hit the ground or anything like that, but it gives us some additional texture to our scene. Right? If we did decide to do the whole cable, and I'm just going to swap this to the teal as well. It's going to make everything teal. To me, to my eye, on a cable this large, this prominent, that feels like it's too much. Okay? So I don't really want to do that. I'm going to switch that one back to cable. Okay? But what I might consider is adding it to a couple more edge loops, or face loops. So maybe I'll go something like every third. Maybe I'll grab that one as well, and that one. And on the back side here, we just kind of swing the camera around. And we'll go with that one. Then we will assign our teal there. So we get a little bit more, but we're retaining some texture. If we go to our rendered preview, get out of edit mode. Okay, we get that. And that still actually might be a little bit too much for my taste. So I think what I might do, let's try this. Let's just do get rid of these two. We'll select those two and click Assign. Something like that. So we get a little bit more hitting the wall because of that back face. Yeah, I think we can go with that for now. Okay, so that's one option. Another option that you can do is we've got all these edge loops here. They're not perfectly evenly spaced. But if we pretend that they are evenly spaced, I'm going to go into local view here, front view. If we were to pretend that these were evenly spaced, or we took the time to actually evenly space them, actually we can take the time to evenly space these. Here's how we're going to do that, because we can do this pretty quickly. I'm just going to add a plane right above them. Tab into edit mode. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees around the x-axis so it's facing us. And I'm going to scale it down. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to basically snap it to... I'm going to cut it off at the seams. I don't want to go over the seams. But I'll just snap it to those seams. So I'm going to take this side, and I've got vertex snapping set. G, X, hold down Control, and we're going to snap it there. And over here, G, X, we'll snap it right over here. Okay, so now if we go here, oh, it looks like I went a little bit too far on this side, so we'll snap that. G, X, and we'll snap it over there. Oh, no. Actually, what we can do, what I should be doing, is select them both. Go into edit mode on both so I can see what's going on. There we go. So I've snapped it between the two, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 edge loops. Okay, so I'm going to add in Control R, 8 loop cuts. Right click to keep them evenly centered. Then I can go down to our cable, bring these out, snap them in there. I can grab the vertical, GX. I can also do this in wireframe, so I can just click and drag across. GX, snap, GX, snap, GX, snap. Now, this could very well affect the UV unwrap, so we may need to re-unwrap this. But it would be the same way that we did before, so I'm not going to show that in this already hour-long video. Just want to show you how we can get our nice, even loop cuts here. And the reason I want these nice, even loop cuts is now I can select all of these vertical edge loops, all 8 of them, which I have. Then I'm going to hit Control B to bevel them. And let's say, we'll say something like that works. I don't need to be too picky. With them still selected, I'm going to add another shader to this, or another material slot to this object. Set that to Cable Emit Teal. And I'll change this first one. Click on this little icon here and change it to Cable Base. Tab out of that. I can now delete my reference plane because it was really just there, so I could add those evenly spaced edge loops and snap. Okay, now we can go to we'll get out of local view first. Go to our material preview, and make sure we assign our teal. There we go. Okay, so now we've got some evenly spaced edge loops, or evenly spaced emission loops. Look at that in rendered view. And I think that looks also pretty cool. And again, I think it's about using it in moderation. Like, we're going to do a fair amount of this, but we're not going to just cover everything in Emission, because that would be too much. All right. And then if we want to change the color here, what we can do is we can select our Cable Emit Teal object, click this little duplicate icon here. It's going to create a copy of that material We can rename it. So let's call this one yellow. And then I can change the color to a nice, vibrant, bright, cyberpunky yellow. And so now we have that. And we can reuse these too. So one thing that I found looked really good is if we come over here to this object, and we'll go in solid view so you can see what's going on. If I select this face, actually we don't want all of that, we just want here. You know what we can do is we can just select that. I'm going to hold down Control and click, and that's going to select the shortest path. Hold down Control, click, hold down Control, click, hold down Control, and click. Okay, so we selected that ring, and then I want to grow this selection because I want to get these holding edges here and this last loop. So I'm going to hit Control plus. I'm going to grow that a little bit. Again, here's another reason why good topology is important. All right. And then I'm going to give this a second material slot, and we will set this to that emission teal. Click Assign, tab out, and go to Rendered View. And now we have this really cool glow. And I think that's a really interesting way to add some dimension and some interest without, again, just kind of blasting everything out. I found that if you go on the front face, it can look really overpowering. But let's say, and we can do the same thing in here. Grab this face, hold down Control, click here, and then continue this around into here. Control plus to grow that selection, and assign our teal. So now both of those, when we look at the render view there, I think that looks pretty cool. One thing that we might need to do is select this teal. I'm going to make a copy of that. I'm going to call this teal underscore low. I'm just going to bring that strength down to 1. It's not quite as intense as the cables are. And we get this really lovely gradation there. Okay. Occasionally you may want to have one on the surface. So maybe we take this object here. Well, maybe not that one. Would be a good candidate for this. Like, I know for these objects, I also went inside the rim here. I think that worked really well. I did that for a lot of them because I thought that was probably the best look. Also for these, on these internal rims right here. Oops. There and there and there. I'll hit Control plus, give that a new material slot, and we'll make those yellow. Assign. And now we get this nice little ambient glow there. And so as you continue to do this, it's going to really help the scene feel cyberpunky, and it's going to help take it out of the normal everyday world and push it into sci-fi. And so that's what I did here when I got some additional colors going on the braided cables. You can see in here, I just selected, if you hover over one cable, hit L, it's just going to select that one cable. So you can either do that. So let's, maybe this one's going to be yellow. We'll change this to our base color. Oh, I didn't click Assign, did I? There we go. Or what you could do, I haven't actually tried this out yet, but I'm curious to see how it would look, is you can just select individual face loops. And maybe this one is going to be teal. We'll click Assign there, and then we'll change this to our base color. And then we can hit render on that and see what that looks like. Okay, so we got a couple of different options. Maybe what I would do here is, let me get rid of this one. I'm gonna make that one black again, and then maybe I'll push this one into the teal and just kind of make that gap between the two a little bit wider. And I think that looks a little bit better. But you got a few different options there. So play around with these things. You can really experiment pretty quickly with a bunch of different looks and seeing kind of what works for you, what doesn't. Inside and outside faces. In the next video, in the next two videos, we're going to both begin adding these materials and textures finally. But we'll also talk about how I did these windows. Okay, there's a little bit more to it than you might first think, but we can walk through that step by step. And it's the same thing I did for both windows, as well as this big vertical sign. Yeah, and so we'll get to that, and then maybe I'll also, as a bonus, I'll talk about how I did the monkey neon sign, the Suzanne neon sign, for our monkey vending machine. So that'll be next time. See you then.